In this module, we're going to turn to two more important labor market institutions, minimum wage laws and occupational licensing laws. The reason this chapter has monopsony in the title is because it's only in monopsonies that the minimum wages have their desired effect. In a monopsony, there is only one employer for workers. So it can be thought of as a counterpart to monopoly, where there's only one seller of a particular good. In this case, there's only one buyer of labor. In a typical competitive market, we've seen that there's going to be as many buyers of there's going to be many buyers of labor, basically meaning there's going to be a lot of firms. In this type of market, each firm is too small to have an effect on the overall labor market because they employ so few workers. But this isn't the case for every labor market. In some, where there are a small number of employers, whether it's like the auto industry or a professional sports league, firms have outsized influence over wages in the market. So an individual firm in a competitive labor market faces a horizontal demand curve. Now we see this in the figure on the left on our slide. What that means is that basically the firm has to take whatever wage is determined by the market, that they have no power to set wages. And this is going to be determined by the interaction of buyers and sellers, or by firms and workers in this case. So firms don't have the market power to be able to set wages. Basically, if they choose any other wage, they will either have no one working for them if they set the wage too low, or they will pay workers more than workers are willing to work for, and everyone will want to work for them. When firms do have market power, we see the figure on the right take place. They face an upward sloping supply curve, just like in the overall market. So here, firms do have enough market power that they can choose what wage to offer. If they offer lower wages, not that many will be willing to work. If they choose higher wages, then many more are going to want to work for the company, but they're going to have higher labor costs. So we're going to begin this chapter by exploring monopsony firms, where they exist and how they make decisions, before we turn our attention to minimum wages. When we typically think of a monopsonist, we think of the easiest and most striking historical examples usually. So think of company towns from the Progressive era. It could be Pullman, Illinois. It could be Hershey, PA. It could be textile towns in New England. We tend to have this imagination. I included a picture in here on a company town where you have, the factory or a bunch of the manufacturing facilities, and then you have all the houses of the people who live there. Everyone in town works for the company, whether it's, if it's coal mine, like working in the mines or working at the company store, or the schools that they put on. Everyone who works there is, working for the company. So we can use a simple model of competitive labor markets that's adapted slightly for monopsonists to help understand what's going on here. So in the figure in the bottom right, we draw the firm's marginal revenue product as a line MRP. This is also going to be their demand curve. So this is the amount of revenue that an additional worker is producing for them. If the firm wanted to hire more workers, they're going to have to pay a higher wage. Again, this is similar to the overall labor market that we saw before. Because the monopsonist is the only employer in our labor market, the supply curve for the firm is going to be the market supply curve as well. And we could think of the wage at each point on the supply curve as the average wage required at each level of employment. So for an example, at Q1, at that number of workers, the average wage that they're going to pay is going to be W1. Now, we're back to assuming that all workers are homogeneous, that they're interchangeable. So they have the exact same skill level and receive the same wage. And, coal mining in the 1800s, this might have been fairly accurate. Today, if there was monopsony, maybe that wouldn't be the case. But we're going to work with that, at least to start for this model. Now, the change in the total labor cost can be represented by the MC curve, or the marginal labor cost. This is going to rise faster than the average cost. Now, why is this the case? If a monopsonist wanted to hire more workers, they need to increase the wage accordingly. So they want to move from Q2 workers to Q1 workers, increase the quantity of workers. They have to increase the wage they pay them from W2 to W1. Unless they only pay the higher wages to the new hires, which is technically possible, but it's going to make a lot of people unhappy at the firm. So what they try to do is pay, all the workers the same wage. They want to bring in new workers at a higher wage. They will have to increase the incumbents' wages as well. So all workers, new and old, are going to receive the new higher wage. So the marginal cost to employers is going to increase faster than the average cost. Now, a profit maximizing monopsonist will continue hiring workers until the marginal revenue product of those workers equals the marginal labor cost. So what the workers are producing is equal to the cost of those workers. So in this example, that's going to be Q2 workers. That's where the marginal cost curve crosses the marginal revenue product curve. So even though the quantity is determined where marginal cost equals the marginal revenue product, the wage is not determined by that. The wage is going to be determined by the supply curve. So, and the wage level that corresponds with the quantity of labor chosen. So in this case, in Q2. So we trace up Q2 until where it crosses the supply curve. That's going to be the wage, in this case, W2. Now, it's important to note that because of the upward sloping supply curve and the higher marginal labor cost curve that's above that, workers are being paid less than their marginal revenue product, something that Marx would refer to as exploitation of workers. Now, what would this look like if it was a competitive market? Well, in this case, the supply curve would also equal the marginal cost curve. So the quantity demanded is going to be where the supply curve crosses the demand curve, or where the marginal revenue cost curve or marginal cost of labor crosses the marginal revenue product curve. So it's going to be at Q1, and the wage that they're going to pay is at W1. What this tells us, what it shows us, is that workers in an uncompetitive labor market, in a monopsony labor market, are paid lower wages than those in a competitive labor market. But we should note that in a competitive labor market, some workers are paid very low wages because they're willing to work for little. So this idea can be somewhat unrealistic. But basically, it does hold that workers in a monopsony labor market are going to be paid less than those in a competitive labor market. So public policy can try to mitigate the effects of a monopsony. Since they can't force competition, they can try to pass other laws or design other regulations to force firms to act as if there were more competition. So if we impose a minimum wage on a monopsonist, what would happen? So the nice simple figure on the right can show us that. That was meant to be very sarcastic. I don't know if it came out of my voice, but I do hesitate to include these with a bunch of lines, but we'll work through it. This came straight from your textbook. So let's break this down. For monopsonist, we find that where the marginal labor cost curve crosses the marginal revenue product curve at point A. This is going to be the quantity of labor chosen. This is what we did, basically before on the previous slide. Then we determine the wage in this case by where the supply curve crosses that quantity. So at point B. So WM is the wage paid in a monopsonistic market for the quantity of labor QM, or I guess in this case LM. If we moved to a competitive labor market, we would increase the number of workers and the wage would see an increase to WC, which you see here represented by point C on the graph. Now, let's say we set a minimum wage through law. So it's going to intersect, and it's going to be at wage WU. It's going to intersect the supply curve at point D and the marginal revenue product curve at point E. So the firm would be willing to hire LU workers at this wage, basically tracing down from point E. But only L prime or L dash U workers, so at point D, are going to be willing to work at that wage. So basically, we're going to have a shortage of labor. Firms are going to want to hire more workers than they will be able to get from the market. But still, despite the fact there's going to be a shortage of workers, the number of workers that have a job for this monopsonist are going to increase from LM to the L dash U or L prime U. Now, at first, this may seem counterintuitive. What we're saying is that minimum wages can actually increase employment, which shouldn't make sense. To quote Jim Buchanan, it's like finding water running uphill. But this is only true in a very narrow range. Once we raise the minimum wage to a point above the competitive market equilibrium, so above point C on the graph, or the wage WC, we see the typical decreases in employment from the higher wages. So it's only in this narrow range where we're moving from what's going on from the, what's being caused by the fact that the labor market is a monopsony to a competitive market equilibrium. That's where we see the gains from a minimum wage. Now, there's another curious thing going on here. In markets, the invisible hand moves us towards equilibrium. And if you're tired of hearing me talk about the minimum wage, you would hate my principles class even more, where we talk about it quite a bit. But here we see that there is a labor shortage at point E. Invisible hand says, over time, we're going to get rid of that. So this labor shortage is the difference between the quantity of labor demanded by firms, LU, and that is supplied by workers, the L prime U or L dash U. In a typical market, we would see firms raise wages to attract more workers, all the way until we reach point C, that competitive market equilibrium. Because as firms increase their wages, they're willing to hire fewer workers, but more workers are willing to work for them. So we slowly move up, increasing the number of workers willing to work, decreasing the number of open positions until we reach that same point. But that's not going to be the profit maximizing move for a monopsonist. Their profit maximizing move was the LM workers at the WM wages. Now with the minimum wage, their profit maximizing quantity of workers is the L prime U, which is all that they can get at the wage WU, this new minimum wage. So firms are going to want to hire more workers at that wage. They're going to have, open positions, but they're not going to be able to find anyone to be able to fill them. It's an odd situation. So a monopsonist may not be exploiting workers in the Marxist sense. I know I just got done saying earlier that this may be an example of it. It may not be in some situations. So I guess it's not necessarily an example of this traditional Marxist exploitation. So a monopsonist paying these wages that are below the marginal revenue product might not be reaping these windfall profits that we imagine with the smart cigar smoking CEO, the top hat sitting behind their desk, just sitting there laughing, enjoying, immiserating their workers. These firms could be competing in a very competitive industry. Now, it's true that full-on monopsonists are rare, where there's only one employer. So let's turn to a historical example, coal mining. So the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company may have been a monopsonist in Eastern PA, where they were operating in the 1870s, but were they really reaping above normal profits as a result? Because there wasn't just one coal company, there wasn't just one coal mine. The coal industry was highly competitive with a lot of different mines operating. And each coal company had little market power to set really high prices on coal because this is a commodity. You can get the exact same coal, same quality, same characteristics, everything else somewhere else. So they don't have this power to set these really high prices. So they end up facing a horizontal demand curve. So although locally there were a large number of monopsonists, they had a lot of other mines to compete with. So driving up wages at the local level for each coal company may not have increased the number of workers like we saw working through the previous example, because they're in such a highly competitive market. They may not have these really high levels of profit that they can deal with significantly higher labor costs. So in reality, for a wage increase to increase employment, not only does the employer have to be a monopsonist, but they have to face very little competition for their product as well. So it's only in very specific situations.